I'm recording my homily for the second Sunday of Advent. And a lot has happened during this week. So we had the celebration of Immaculate Conception. This week, today's the feast day of Our Lady Guadalupe. And I want to tie some of this together in the context of the season of Advent. So remember in Advent, the first 2 weeks of Advent, they tend not to focus on preparing for Christmas, like preparing in memory of how Jesus came as a child, but in preparing for the end, right? And so we can speak of the end of the world, but I think it's perhaps more applicable to our lives to think about the end of our lives and say, okay, I'm looking at my life and I'm looking at how I'm living it now and the future and saying, am I living it fully? Am I 100% in on this whole gospel thing? Do I really and truly trust Jesus to lead me through the course of my daily decisions, how I use my money, how I interact with people in my relationships? Am I staying focused on what is most important and not allowing myself to get distracted? Because I'm going to use some pretty stark examples today of what distraction does, okay? All right. A couple things, make a few connections here. Now you might think, well, these are just coincidences. Maybe they are. I don't think they're coincidences, okay? If you were to go back 76 years, okay? Go back 76 years ago. December 7th, that's the vigil, that's the day before, the eve of the Immaculate Conception. That's the day that Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. It's a very important day for us as Americans. Most Americans know that event was kind of a domino in a series of events that would follow very quickly after that. I think there's a connection though, because the Immaculate Conception, she is the patron of the United States. Now you might be thinking, well, getting bombed and celebrating a spiritual event, our patroness, they seem to be very opposite. But that's exactly how God works, is when we in the world bring up darkness, He brings up light. And He wants us to see that, right? It's right before our eyes. So, okay. The next day, December 8th, the feast day of the Immaculate Conception, we declare war on Japan. And I suppose you could understand that, right? After they bombed Pearl Harbor and killed many people. I think there's a spiritual connection to the political events that were happening, okay? Political, I just mean the events happening in our world. Okay. 3 days later, Hitler, Nazi Germany, declares war on the United States because they were coming to bat for Japan. I think they were really just looking for a reason to declare war on the United States. But so 3 days later, the 3 days later was the vigil, the day before the feast day of the Our Lady of Guadalupe. Now, Our Lady of Guadalupe, if you live in a parish with lots of Hispanics, you're used to that being a very big celebration. If you don't, you may not know, you may not realize that the feast, Our Lady of Guadalupe, she is the patroness of all the Americas, right? And so if you say, what unites us as the Americas, as the New World? It's Our Lady of Guadalupe, in terms of a spiritual connection. Now, that day is the day that Hitler declares war on the United States. And a lot of things were going to follow after that. It truly, at that point, was becoming a world war. And you would be hard-pressed to find any situation where more people died than in World War II. Now, there may be other examples where more people died, but World War II is a modern example of darkness in our world, and of good fighting evil, but still darkness. So, Our Lady of Guadalupe. Now, one of the things I was sharing on the Feast day of Immaculate Conception about Our Lady of Guadalupe, if you look at the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, she has a mantle, right? Now, there's 3 forms of light that are shown in the image. You have the sun, which is the brightest form of light in our entire solar system. In fact, even though it's cloudy right now, that's what's giving us light. Okay, it's it's the brightest light in our world, if you will. So the sun is behind Mary in that image. And so that's hearkening back to the book of Revelations, where it speaks of the woman who's getting ready to give birth to the Savior. and she's in this cosmic battle, and the sun, she's clothed with the sun. Okay? Now, the moon, which in the image is portrayed as a black moon because it's an eclipse, the moon is in front of the sun, Mary's standing on the moon. So that's the second form of light. That's the second brightest light, if you will, in our world. It's not really a form of light. The moon simply reflects the sun. We often, in spiritual terms, we often say Mary is an example of the moon because she reflects her son. She reflects the light from the Son of God. And so she's standing on the moon. She's in the same location as the moon. She's the one reflecting. Okay, but her garment, her mantle, is covered in stars. And so that's the third form of light. And the stars, even when it's cloudy, even when you can't see the stars, we know they're there. And when we can see them, and we're outside the light pollution of a city, they're so magnificent. They're so beautiful. When you see the Milky Way at night, it's just incredible. So she's clothed with those stars. And I think that represents, even though they're not the brightest light in the world, they truly are, what's the word I'm looking for? They're always there. They're always there. And yeah, they're moving because we're moving, but they're always there. So there's a strength in that. But the little insight in this is that her mantle is dark. It's black. It's almost black. It's a kind of a greenish, but it's really, really dark. And it symbolizes the night, right? So she has the stars on her, but she also has the night. And to remember that this image from the book of Revelations, she's in a battle. She's in the midst of the battle, and she's not afraid. She's not cowering. She's getting ready to give birth to her son. So how does Our Lady do battle? She gives birth. She becomes a great mother. And so if you think in our world about when our world is going crazy, it's like, what do we need? Well, we need love. And we need a lot of love. And we need courageous love. And so for mothers, for women who maybe say, well, we don't necessarily have a place like in a battle, if we think traditionally of how men are usually the ones who are the soldiers going into war, you say, no, in the real battle, women are right there in the center, right, with Our Lady. And so her motherhood becomes the number one way that we conquer Satan. Okay, now the mantle is dark, it's black. To me, it almost symbolizes the image of Satan trying to grab Mary, trying to surround her with darkness, trying to destroy what she's getting ready to do, to give birth to her son. And then those the three forms of light represent that which conquers that darkness. Now, in Revelations, it's the dragon, right? The dragon is coming after her. So I'm going to take a little bit of this. I was watching a documentary not too long ago. I actually watched two documentaries, both on one was on World War II, one was on the Korean War. The one on the Korean War was interviewing some soldiers who were in a battle that was virtually hopeless. I have to say it, we kind of abandoned them because China during the Korean War did a surprise attack. We didn't realize they were going to come down and invade Korea the way they did, and many of our soldiers became surrounded and cut off, and the decision was basically we could do nothing for them. If they were going to get out, they were going to have to get out on their own, and they were getting slaughtered, just absolutely slaughtered. So they interviewed some of the soldiers who did make it out, and it was very interesting because one of them, these two soldiers were in the same unit, so they were experiencing the same thing, but one of them said, I was just so afraid. It was just always so afraid. And everything he conveyed was he simply wanted to survive. That was like his number one priority. He simply wanted to survive. And he said he couldn't imagine any other soldier thinking anything other than that. But then he interviewed another soldier who was with him, and he said, no, I really wasn't afraid. I wasn't afraid. It's like, if your name's on that bomb, your name's on that bomb, and you're going to die. If your name's on a bullet, you're going to get shot. And there's really nothing you can do about it. So he said, I wasn't afraid. I was just trying to do everything I could for the sake of getting out alive, for the sake of working with the unit, for the sake of accomplishing the mission. And so he kept talking about the mission. Very different attitudes. And as I was watching that, I was thinking, of myself, but also us as Christians in this world. Do we think more about ourselves? Do we think more about our survival? Do we spend most of our time trying to make money for ourselves or trying to accomplish things for ourselves, even for our family, our family units like ourselves? But we're really not thinking of the other. It's like we're afraid to go all in on the gospel. We're truly afraid to go all in. I had a priest friend who was telling me about this movie he had watched, and it was about this young mom with her daughter, and it was just very, very, very dysfunctional. And the daughter eventually ends up getting taken away by CPS because of drugs and prostitution and all this stuff. And I was thinking as he was describing this movie how I normally, as priests, we would never encounter those people. We would never see them. Unless they came to us at the church, we would simply never see them. And so it's almost like there's this fear of going all in with our world, of just really immersing ourselves in that darkness, and kind of like being Mary, and even allowing that mantle of darkness to rest on her shoulders, even though she's also surrounded by light. So she's placing herself right there in the midst of it, and not being afraid to encounter the darkness. I'll give a couple more examples. So I was watching this documentary, very interesting documentary on World War II. And so there was this German before the war who immigrated to the United States, and he studied psychology, became a psychologist, and joined the American Army. And so in the midst of the war, as the war was unfolding, he ended up serving over back basically in his homeland in Germany, but he was serving for the Americans. And so his job as a psychologist was, as we were winning the war and we're marching through Germany, and Germany is completely getting obliterated and we're getting ready to take them over, he's interviewing as many people in Germany as possible, as many average people, teachers, and just normal people in the villages, as well as leaders, as well as military leaders and soldiers. He's interviewing them, trying to get a sense of what inspired them to do what they did in Nazism, to to start the war, to conquer, to pillage other countries, and then the ultimate, when they came across the concentration camps, what inspired them to do that? And it was very interesting as he interviewed these people, their responses, and most of them said, "Hey, wasn't my fault. I'm not the Nazi. I just followed along, right? I just followed along. It was the other people. They were the fanaticals. It wasn't me." Everyone was saying that. Even the people who worked in the concentration camps were saying that. I just followed along. The interesting thing, though, because if you were to take that at its face value, you'd say, okay, there was a domination of fear in Germany, that Hitler used fear to control his people. But the psychologist said there was no fear. He says there was no evidence of manipulating the people in that way, using fear. There was no threat that, this idea that if they didn't do it, they would be killed. There wasn't that. He said the people wanted to do it. So as he asked them more questions, he realized that these people, who by and large were Lutherans or Catholics, were all in. We're all in on the Nazi agenda. And all he had to do was start asking them questions about the different races. What did they think about the Jews? What did they think about the Polish? And as he asked those questions, immediately he could see Nazism come right to the surface, and they were passionate. They had to get rid of those problem people, right? And so he realized, no, this was a nation that was all in. But they were not willing to accept responsibility for their actions, because they were living in fear. They were living in this fear, not fear of each other, not fear of Hitler, but fear of what they had been taught to fear. They had been brainwashed to fear the Jews or the Poles or even the Catholics, the Catholic priests, right? Very interesting. He also interviewed a Catholic bishop who was living in, I can't remember if it was Germany or Austria, but he was living in that occupied area, And he interviewed him, and as he was talking to him, he said, why didn't you do more? Why didn't you oppose Nazism? You know, why didn't you speak to the evils of Nazism? And he simply said, to oppose Nazism was to choose martyrdom. And so the psychologist, who was not Christian or Catholic, he was actually Jewish, he began to preach the gospel to this bishop. And he said, but didn't Jesus do that? And as they continued talking, the bishop said, if you expect us to be martyrs, then you're expecting something that's unrealistic. You see, the bishop, he was a bishop, right? He was a bishop. You think he would be all in. He wasn't all in. I don't know if you could honestly say he was all in on Nazism, but he was definitely more in on Nazism than he was on the gospel, because he obeyed Nazism. He didn't obey the gospel. He betrayed it. In Advent, as we're looking at our lives, we're saying, who do I have stronger allegiance to? The culture? Or to the gospel, to Jesus Christ, to the church, to my brothers and sisters? Who do I have a greater allegiance to? When the American forces were going into Germany, they were going into this one town, and they were about 1 day away. They were 1 day away from reaching this town and conquering, basically taking over this town. And that day, the vigil, right, the day before, you know what they were doing? They were at a professional soccer game. Thousands of people cheering on their soccer team. And they're 1 day away from getting conquered. What he discovered was, as he went through Germany, was that they were so much living on the fat, on the spoils of war, that they were not suffering. They really weren't. The countries that they had pillaged all around them, there was famine. People were dying of hunger. I mean, it was just horrible. And yet they're living on the fat of all of that. They're completely in their own little world, because they were all in on it. And so, say, are we living off the fat of other people? Are we living off the spoils of our world? I was talking to the confirmation kids this week. I'm sorry, this is a really long homily, so I'm sorry. I apologize for this. I was talking to the confirmation kids this week, and I talked to them about the four types of love. And I want to go through that, because as we are looking at our own lives, and as we're getting ready to begin to look at Christmas and how Jesus came, it's important to say, am I all in? And then look at these 4 types of love. Because Jesus had all these 4 types of love in his life. The saints, when we look at the saints, they had all 4 types. Now, we may be doing 3, we may be doing 2, we may have 1, we may not have any. If somebody's life is really broken. But our goal is to have all 4 and to really work on them, to really try to grow in them. Okay? The first type of love is the physical love. How do we show physical love? At all the masses, the very first answer people gave, because I expected people to answer the question, the very first answer they gave was to give hugs, right? To give hugs. And obviously in appropriate ways, but to give hugs. It's a universal gesture of affection. And so even guys will do it, they'll give man hugs, right? They pat each other on the back. You ever go to a priest ordination where all the priests get to greet the newly ordained priest? There's a lot of hugging. So it's things like that. It's a great way to show. Sometimes people who are very lonely, they say, you know what, all I need is a hug. Okay? Because it's an expression of love. Kissing is very much an expression of intimacy. In some cultures, it doesn't have any sexual context to it. It's just a form of showing affection. In other cultures, it has more of a connection to like boyfriend, girlfriend, or something like that, right? But it's still a sign of affection. You ever come to the Spanish Mass and during the sign of peace, during the kiss of peace, I mean, you can close your eyes, you can hear the sign of peace. You can hear them all kissing. It's very much a part of their culture. It's a sign of love, okay? Handshakes, Making eye contact is even in some ways a physical form of showing recognition of a person's dignity, as opposed to when we avoid eye contact, it's like I don't want to have anything to do with that person, right? Okay, so physical forms of affection. Jesus did that all the time when he was out, when he would go into a village and he would look for somebody, or he was talking to somebody. There was some physical way that he would interact with them. If he was healing somebody, he would often touch them. Or he would, remember when he smeared mud in their eyes, there was something to connect him to that person. Simple forms of affection, and very, very necessary. In my own family, we're kind of Northern European, so we did not grow up in a very physically affectionate home. There was a lot of love in our home, but not necessarily physically affectionate love. And as I talk to my brothers and sisters now that we're older, and you see how they're raising their kids, you see them showing, maybe a little bit more of that. And I think we would agree that there's something necessary, there's something very important about that. That when it's not there, it's definitely, there's a lacking to it. And I'm speaking of physical affection, obviously in a very appropriate way. And I would include that to the highest, if you will, the most intimate form of physical affection, which is in the sexual relationship. And that is in marriage, that belongs in marriage. It's so powerful because it can create a whole nother human being that then enters into that loving relationship, that becomes a part of that becomes actually the focal point of the husband and the wife, who now become the father and the mother. And so it's a powerful thing. And yet in our culture, we've betrayed it, right? We betrayed that. We turned it into a game, we turned it into a sport, but it is not represented as an exclusive form of love. And so we need to reclaim that. So part of going all in with Jesus Christ is to go all in with that, to say this is what is appropriate. This is what belongs in our relationships. This is a form of love. And so we then fight the culture, not like we fight people, we fight the culture of the betrayal of that form of love. Okay, so that's physical. Then you have the emotional form of expressing love. Well, how do we show love emotionally? Well, one person at Mass said, well, we cry. God made it. God made us to cry. We laugh. Neither of those are very rational things, but they're expressions of emotion. The emotions are very complicated. Psychologists will say that a person's ability to read the emotions of another person is absolutely key to happiness for that person. The ability to interact and respond and love in that manner is very important, but it's also very complicated. And so people who are wounded begin to build walls in those areas, right, in the emotions, because they've been hurt. But showing emotional expressions of love is very important. Words of encouragement, right? Telling your kids that they're doing a great job, encouraging them on, as opposed to the opposite where, a child's constantly getting torn down or being told that they're worthless. That's emotional damage that is done. We call it emotional abuse. And so the emotional love is very, very important. And you can see in Jesus' life, as he interacts, he always seems to target, if you will, the poor, the vulnerable, and he shows lots of connection with them. He defends them. He encourages people to love them. That's emotional support. Is that important in marriage? Absolutely. When one person is walling off the other person, when one person's gone cold emotionally, it begins to damage all the other forms of love that are there. So it's very important. And so just reflecting on your own life and saying, okay, am I showing that kind of support, love, intimacy to the people around me? Obviously in appropriate ways, right? Okay. The third form of love that we need in our lives is intellectual love. We don't often think of love as an intellectual thing, or we think that if somebody's very intellectual, they're not a very amorous person or somebody who shows lots of love. But if you really think about it, We show lots of love intellectually. Think of a teacher who loves teaching, who's teaching their students, but by how they treat the students as they teach them, the students know that they're being loved, that they're being taught because they're loved, and then they begin to love learning. When somebody loves something, we love learning from them. I think of the greatest teachers I had, and it was those who truly loved, well, they loved their students, but they truly loved what they were teaching. And so it's contagious, it's infectious, and so you want to learn those things. And people will often choose their careers based on a mentor, based on somebody they knew who loved what they were doing and then taught them. Okay? Parents, you teach your kids every single day, right? And you feel like a broken record sometimes. Don't do that, don't do that, don't do that, or do this, do this, do this. It's not about rules. It's not because you're trying to limit their freedom. You're trying to teach them how to make good decisions. You're trying to do what's best for them, right? You don't eat 5 chocolate chip cookies before dinner, right? Maybe you have a banana. So you're trying to do that because you care about them. Whereas somebody who doesn't care about them says, I don't care what you do. Do whatever you want. Eat 5 donuts. I don't care, right? So love is teaching. There's lots of teaching involved in love. Between a husband and wife, when they share their vision, they share their desires, they share what they're thinking, there is definitely love being communicated. Okay. Did Jesus do that? All the time. He was always teaching the gospel. Everywhere he went, he was teaching the gospel. He was always teaching the people. And so we're all teachers. Everywhere we go, we can, in that way of love, we can teach. Okay. The last form of intimacy that we truly need in our life, and I would dare say it's a linchpin of any culture, any healthy culture, and that's spiritual intimacy. We really need spiritual intimacy. Spiritual intimacy begins first and foremost with a simple question: do I love God? Do you love God? Are you in love with Him? Do you spend time with Him? If somebody says, oh yeah, I love God, and then they spend no time with Him, they don't really love Him. They think they love Him. But that would be like somebody saying, oh yeah, I love my wife, and then he spends no time with her. So, okay. Do I love God? Do I enjoy spending time with Him? Do I enjoy reading about Him? You know, spiritual books, the Bible. Do I enjoy talking to people about Him? And I'm not talking about religion or talking about politics, religion in the political sense, but do I enjoy talking to people about Jesus, about God? Do I enjoy it? Spiritual intimacy. We don't teach our couples, we don't teach our husbands and wives to pray together. Well, if they come to confession where I am at, they get asked that question over and over and over. Are you praying with your spouse every day? Spiritual intimacy, it's very, very important. Without it, there's a missing component to the intimacy that belongs in the marriage. You know, there's so many couples today who try to hang their marriage on one or two of those forms of intimacy. Often it's the physical. You'll see that in young couples. They'll shack up, right? They'll move in together. They get to know each other a little bit. They shack up. They're having a sexual relationship. And they're trying to hang everything on that, and it doesn't work because it was never meant to do that. But they don't quite have the tools yet to have the other forms of love. So that's why it's such a disaster. That's why that is such a disaster. Okay. Spiritual intimacy. Do you pray with your children? I know you've heard me say this before. I don't care. Do you pray with your children? Because they learn from that how to be in love. They learn how to be in love with Jesus Christ. During Mass, when I'm up there, sometimes I'll hear a parent saying, look at Jesus, look at Jesus, you know. It's not really they're teaching them like intellectually anything. They're not teaching them theology. They're teaching them intimacy. They're saying, there's one that you love. This is the one whom we love. This is why we're here, right? It's not time to play on your phone. This is time to spend with the one we love. So, spiritual intimacy. All right, these forms of love all become avenues of how we go 100% in on the gospel, and how we also identify things in our culture that are pulling us away from being 100% in. All right. Now, eventually, next week, we're going to start talking about Christmas. We're going to start talking about preparing in memory of how Jesus came. All right. God bless.